सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The Q1 GDP data is here, and as we've talked about before, this financial year is important because it's the pre-election year and it sets the tone for the entire economic discourse running into the elections. So how is the economy done in Q1? That's what we're going to discuss in this episode. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and we have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP. Thank you so much, Radhika, for joining us and for analyzing the data for us. So now, Radhika, looking at the overall number, do you feel that this 7.8 growth that we saw in Q1, is that a good performance or is it weaker than expected?
I think it's a good performance and it is on expected lines. If you see, the projections that were made around for the Q1 GDP numbers, we saw RBI projecting 8% growth.
That's right.
Most of the projections were around this number, ranging from 7.7 to 8.2%. So I think it is in line with expectations, particularly because it's coming on a high base of 13.1%.
Right.
Because if you remember in the corresponding quarter of last year, we got a growth of 13.1%. So on top of that, if we are getting a 7.8% growth on an aggregate basis, it's an encouraging growth. And also from January to March quarter also, it's a step up that we are seeing an increase in growth, not only as compared to the same quarter of last year, but also as compared to the previous quarter. So
the immediately
preceding quarter, the March quarter. So these show encouraging trend. In fact, the aggregate number is quite encouraging given the global challenges and other domestic problems that we are facing.
Right. So now, is there a particular sector that you would say has driven this growth?
Yeah, I think it's the services that has driven the growth. And if you see, so services comprise of three subsectors. So it has financial and real estate, it has trade, transport and hospitality, communication and public administration.
Right.
And if you see the year-on-year growth in all these three subsectors within services, they have exhibited higher growth as compared to the March quarter, as compared to the previous quarter. Particularly financial sector and real estate has shown a growth of 12.2%. So these are good growth, and overall services have also seen a growth of more than 10%. So it's a double-digit growth. Remember, these were the sectors which were hard hit during the COVID pandemic. All these contact intensive sectors, hospitality sectors face severe blow to their growth during pandemic, and now we are seeing there is a sharp rebound. And also when you look at the high frequency indicators, because this is an aggregate number, if we disaggregate and look at some of the high frequency numbers capturing the services sector, it tells us the story that yes, services are seeing a rebound. Look at the passengers handled at the airport. We are seeing a growth rate of more than 20% over the last 4-5 months. So we are seeing a growth rate, hospitality, hotel occupancy rate, all these sectors are seeing higher growth. E-way bills, volume are growing at a sharp pace. So if we look at the services, PMI services has risen to multi-year high since 2010. So services are exhibiting higher growth, and from the economic activity side, it's the services that have driven this growth of 7.8%.
Okay, and so now we know that the manufacturing sector is very dear to this government and it is an important part of the economy. So we need to discuss how has it been doing?
Yeah, so it showed only a marginal growth as compared to the March quarter. So in March quarter, we saw a growth of 4.5%, and now we saw a growth of 4.7%. So despite easing of commodity prices, so it was expected that due to easing of commodity prices, the margins of companies will improve, and therefore profitability will rise, and that would have an impact on gross value addition, which is what is captured from the economic activity side. When we look at agriculture, manufacturing, services, we are measuring gross value addition. Okay? So that is but we did not see a very strong growth in manufacturing sector. So it shows that there is an uneven growth in manufacturing sector. There are some sectors which are doing well, but most of the sectors are not doing well. They are also impacted by global economic slowdown. Their demand is not picking up. So all these things have impacted manufacturing sector. So it continues to be the weak point in India's growth trajectory.
And this ties into what we had talked about in one of the previous episodes, that even though overall corporate profits have been growing,
Yes.
the amount of tax that they've been paying is not so much, because the high tax paying corporate sectors have actually not been doing that well.
So it ties well with the discussion that we had about muted corporate tax growth also. So it just shows an uneven growth structure within the manufacturing sector, particularly sectors like textile is not doing well for many quarters now.
Yes.
So there are some sectors which continue to show weak growth, and that is getting reflected in the overall manufacturing sector performance.
Right. And now coming to the agriculture sector, I remember from the data that it's one of the few sectors that did better in this quarter than in the same quarter of last year.
Yes.
But do you feel that this is sustainable? I mean, everybody's talking about El Nino and the impact that this might have this year.
So we saw agriculture growing at 3.5%, 3.5%, which is higher than 2.4% of the same quarter last year, but lower than the January to March quarter.
Right.
So in January to March quarter, agriculture saw growth of 5.5%. Now we saw 3.5%. So there is a marginal slowdown, but what we need to see is in the subsequent quarters. So where agriculture performance could come under pressure due to the looming impact of El Nino, which we've seen in August. What happens in September? So that will determine what will be the performance of agriculture in the July-September quarter as a whole, because we have seen uneven rainfall distribution. There have been parts of the country which have received surplus rains. There have been parts of the countries which have received deficient. So September month is going to be critical. If we are going to see more even distribution of rainfall, then agriculture sector could perform well. Otherwise, there could be pressure on agriculture sector performance because the sowing will get impacted, and then the prices will get impacted, and then it will have a spillover effect on farmers' terms of trade also. All these things. So agriculture sector, which was holding up till now, from COVID, we have seen agriculture sector has been growing at 4%, 4.5%.
It's been the one bright spot.
Yes, one bright spot. And so, and consistently over a large number of quarters we have seen. But now we have to see that might be there will be some pressure on agriculture sector due to all these challenges that we are seeing: climate change, El Nino, uneven distribution of rainfall, and so on.
So now the agriculture sector is such that it impacts various different things. So up till now, we've been seeing high inflation because of high veggie prices. So now if the agriculture sector slows down and there's output falls in the second half of the year, then again we'll see prices going up.
Yeah, we'll see prices going up. That is one. And rural demand will get impacted more, which is what will then impact our consumption, because now global demand is slowing down. So consumption, private domestic consumption has to do the heavy lifting. And if agriculture sector does not perform well, it will have an impact on rural demand, prices, output, and so on. So, so second half of the year definitely is going to see some slowdown in growth, and therefore overall growth is predicted to be around 6% because we have seen 7.8% in first quarter, but going forward things could become challenging.
And that's what even the RBI had predicted anyway, a slowing down
gradual,
in each quarter.
Absolutely.
So now you mentioned consumption. What has the consumption data for this quarter shown?
So this quarter has shown a decent growth consumption, but what's important is to also look at again the high frequency indicators. So we've looked at high frequency indicators in our article, and what we see is that the consumption growth is also quite uneven. It's not broad based. For example, there are some sectors, some consumption indicators that are doing well. Steel consumption is doing well, cement is doing well, all the sectors are doing well. Within the auto sector, we are seeing a differential performance.
Right.
Passenger cars are not doing well, whereas multi-utility vehicles are doing well. Van sales are
see.
doing well. So it's not a broad-based growth. Again, basically the rural demand indicators still need to catch up with urban demand indicators. So tractor sales, two-wheeler sales, we see in some months there is a pickup and then again it falls. So we do not see a sustained encouraging growth in the rural sector demand. So that is why, even though we have seen that consumption growth has improved from the last quarter, but whether it will be sustained or not, that depends. It needs to become more broad-based, and
Right.
it will become more broad-based when we will see a moderation in food inflation, because that impacts the discretionary
Yeah.
consumption, particularly of the rural population. So if the food inflation is controlled, vegetable prices, cereal prices are controlled, that will have a positive impact on rural discretionary consumption. But definitely we should see some pickup during the festival season. We should see an increase. So
Right.
that is going to be very critical, what happens in the coming months on consumption.
Right. And now, is this being reflected in the investment that's going in, the capital formation?
Yeah.
One side is government, of course, but do
Yes.
we even have any idea of how the private sector has been investing?
So if we look at the GDP numbers, we get only at the aggregate
The
level.
gross level.
The gross fixed capital formation.
Right.
The breakup comes with a lag of 2 years. So
I see.
we have the private and public sector data only till 2021-22. But we do have many indicators to get a picture about what's happening to the private sector investment. But first, if we look at gross fixed capital formation, it has shown a growth of 8%. And so even if we look at last 3-4 quarters, growth rate has been around 8 to 9%, which is good, driven by government capex, both central and state government. We've spoken about in a previous episode that in the first quarter, government capex grew by more than 59%. State capex grew by 75%. So it's not just the central government capital expenditure, but states are also showing signs of pickup because of higher devolution from central government to states. So that is one part of the story. But it needs to also get it needs to lead to crowding in of private investment. Private sector also needs to now show signs of pickup. And there, one of a very important indicator is the capacity utilization, which is released by RBI. It shows what's happening to capacity utilization, order books, the state of inventories in the manufacturing sector. Though it comes with a lag, we have the data, it was released last week for the January to March quarter, and it showed a pickup to 76%, from 74% to 76%, which is a very encouraging number, because anything above 75% shows that capacity utilization is increasing, investment is picking up. So that is a encouraging sign. But it's not durable, because when we look at the capex data from Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, we saw that in the Jan to March quarter, the new projects picked up. But again, in the April to June quarter, it reduced to half of what we saw in Jan to March. So again, private sector investment, though, is showing signs of pickup, it's not durable yet. So that is something which is again going to become challenging. As you pointed out at the beginning of the episode, it's a pre-election year. If the capex momentum slows down because government wants to give more subsidies in light of higher food inflation, we have seen government slashing the cooking gas prices by rupees 200. That will impose subsidy burden. So somewhere some prioritization would have to be done to achieve fiscal deficit. Maybe capex gets impacted in the coming months. So in the coming quarters, things are going to, we need to look at the capex, because government capex could also come under pressure. And that will, if that happens, then the GFCF growth that we are seeing could also come under pressure.
So now we have some questions from the audience. But before I get to that, just a little note to the audience. So a lot of you have been requesting that we name you when we ask the question that you've sent in, which we are happy to do. The only issue is that a lot of questions come under anonymous usernames. So please, if you want us to name you, please leave your name. And we have questions here with people who have left their names. So let's get on with those questions. So the first question is from Aditya, who asks, do you think that we'll see in 2024, over the course of this year, any impact of the economic turmoil that we're seeing in the US and Europe? But I thought, US is no longer in any sort of turmoil as such, but Europe seems to be.
Europe seems to be, but now if we look at the fresh data that is coming from the US also, we are seeing the easing happening in the labor market, which was till now, we've discussed in the previous episodes that labor market has held up in the US. Unemployment rate has been low. The non-farm payroll employment was rising at a sharp pace, but now we have started seeing, in fact, this is the fresh data that was released last week, that even the US labor market is showing signs of slackening. So we are seeing fresh, symptoms of global economic slowdown, not only in the EU, but now also in the US. And that is bound to happen sometime. When you have such an aggressive monetary policy tightening, that will have an impact on demand sooner or later. It will have a lagged impact. So that is what we are seeing. So, and with this thing that, labor market slackening, it will further compress demand. And that's not a good news for India's exports, which already showed a contraction in the first quarter, along with government consumption. So if these signs of slowdown are emerging, new signs of slowdown are emerging, that's not a good news for our exports, which are already posing a drag on economic growth.
Right. So, that's a great question then, Aditya. Actually, this data about the US, the most recent data missed me as well. So thank you for that. And now a question from Sankalp, which again points at quite an interesting facet of the GDP data, that a large part of the Indian economy is informal and it's not captured in the official figures. At least not the fresh figures. The ones that come after 2 years incorporate it. But what we have right now for Q1 is only looking at the formal sector. So how is the informal sector doing? Do we have any proxies to tell? And he also asks, how is the PLI, how are those schemes doing? And are we seeing that the surge in demand to manufacture by people like Foxconn, HP, Dell, will that show itself in these numbers, the GDP numbers?
Okay, so first on the informal sector, you are right that it's not captured at least in the quarterly numbers. It's only, we look at the numbers from the MCA, Ministry of Corporate Affairs database for the manufacturing sector primarily. That's the thing that we see, the listed companies, the organized sector. But we do have some proxies. For example, we need to look at the performance of the MSME sector, because the MSME sector is primarily informal. So if we look at some of the performance indicators of MSME sector, the micro, small and medium, what's happening to their credit demand. There are a lot of surveys that are conducted on a regular basis to assess the performance of MSMEs. So that they can give us some insights on what is happening to MSME sector, what's happening to the delinquencies. If the delinquencies are rising in MSME sector, that gives us some impression about the state of the informal sector. So though it's a lagged data, because what we get is, one is we get data from MSME, from the RBI on the credit that is advanced to MSMEs by banks. But we know that banks are not the only suppliers of credit. It's only a very small proportion of the overall informal credit that is advanced to the MSME sector. The non-bank financial companies are also giving loans to MSMEs, and there we are seeing that there are signs that the MSMEs could face delinquencies, in the sense that they could default because they are facing not a very encouraging operating environment due to higher interest rates and due to higher prices. So that is one indication of how the informal sector is performing. Coming to the PLI scheme, yes, PLI scheme has benefited some sectors. We know mobile phones is a success story.
Right.
A lot of companies have set up their entities in India. But there are a lot of other sectors that have not done well even after receiving the PLI support, the subsidies. Particularly the textile sector has not done well. So there is a need to review the PLI scheme, in which sectors, what kind of incentives are to be given, which sectors are to be incorporated. If we are just imprudently expanding the PLI list, just providing subsidies, is it hampering competition? So all these things also need to be taken into account.
And do those numbers affect the GDP numbers? I mean, in that these promised investments aren't likely to, it's only when the money comes in, right?
So it is quite a lagged phenomenon that we are seeing, that once the subsidies are provided, it will have an impact on investment and exports 1 or 2 years later. So, but what we will have is higher job growth. We will see higher export growth sooner or later on the manufacturing sector. So PLIs are meant to improve the productivity of manufacturing sector, but it is time, and the government also realizes that it's important to review the scheme, what kind of incentives are being given, and also very important part is that there needs to be some database to analyze what has happened to exports and employment due to PLI. So that those are some of the things that need to be done to improve the design of the PLI scheme as such, so that it becomes more useful. But at the same time, an imprudent expansion of sectors lists for PLI due to political economy considerations, that should not be the case. That will further hamper manufacturing sector.
Right. And now we have another question from Aditya, and he touches upon a point that you have already made, which is that with elections, several state elections coming up and then the general elections next year, there is likely to be a lot of, a lot of subsidies that will be announced, a lot of freebies. And so he's asking now, will this impact capital expenditure in the months to come?
Yeah, it could. We need to see what happens to the data, because right now we have yesterday with the GDP number, the Controller General of Accounts also released the fiscal numbers for the central government. And there we saw, for now we have the numbers for the first 4 months from April to July. So central government capex is still holding up. We've seen that central government has spent almost 32% of its budgeted amount on capital expenditure. But we now need to see what happens to states. And right now we do not have the full numbers for all states for July. We only have for 6-7 states who have released their numbers for July as per the CAG monthly report. So this is a very critical point that needs to be seen for both central and state governments. This is one concern that is being raised, that the momentum of capex may slow down in the coming months, and to address the fiscal arithmetic, capex could become a casualty. So that these things need to be seen over the next few months. So in short, the second half of the year is going to be very critical for all these things, for monitoring what happens to agriculture performance, what happens to whether the capex momentum slows down, what happens to fiscal arithmetic. So all these things need to be seen in the coming months.
Right. And now a question from N. Shekhar is, when will it be possible for states like UP, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka to become $1 trillion in size?
So it depends on a lot of, what is the policy environment, what happens to, again, what's their fiscal priorities. Are they paying more attention to capital expenditure? Are they trying to, as a policy measure, trying to give more emphasis on capital expenditure, trying to give more emphasis on foreign investments, so trying to give emphasis on job creation, on skilled labor. So all these things will determine the trajectory of economic growth not only these states, for all states
All of
in
them.
general, and
Right.
for the country as a whole, because a lot of things also depend on what happens to the structure of our labor force, what happens to our demographic dividend, so what happens to labor force participation rate. So all these things will determine, and also what happens to the global economic environment. So it is hard to pinpoint a year by when these states will be able to become a $1 trillion economy, but a lot depends on the policy reforms that these governments take over the next couple of years.
Right. And now we'll conclude with a forward-looking question from Saurabh, which is, what growth rate is needed if we want to become a developed country by 2047?
So again, it depends on what happens to what is the global environment as well, because if everything is normal, we should be having a plus 8% growth rate on a consistent basis.
Right.
Not only a plus 8% consistent growth rate, along with that, we need to, as I mentioned, we need to see what happens to our demographic dividend. We need to see what happens to our labor force participation rate, skilled labor, manufacturing. We need to see that the share of manufacturing in the overall GDP rises. So all these things will determine the composition of growth, because it's not just growth. That sharp growth needs to be sustained also over the next couple of years. So for all these things, reforms are needed. Female labor force participation rate needs to improve. Whatever needs to be taken to ease the cost of doing business in the country. Foreign investments, because we saw FDI sharply falling in the first quarter of the current financial year.
Right.
So all these things need to be addressed. But I think we need to grow consistently at 7 to 8% to achieve this advanced economy status by 2047.
Right. And so that's what we have through this discussion. The economy in the first quarter grew quite strongly, 7.8%, coming on a base of 13.1%. That's quite a creditable performance. But once we go a little deeper, we see that there are some pain points that remain. The manufacturing sector hasn't grown as fast as we would like it to. The agriculture sector has done better than it did last year, but coming up are all of the concerns to do with El Nino, and it's a critical period that we're entering. So we don't know whether the sector will continue to grow strongly or not. The services sector is doing quite well, but again, it's slightly uneven growth, but overall, it's double-digit growth in several of the services sectors. So that's good news. Government investment in capital formation is growing strongly, which we need to see whether it will continue in the coming months, because there might be some pressure on them to start doing more subsidies, more freebies. So we'll see if they still have the money left over to do capex. We hope that they do. But so overall, the economy, at least in Q1, seems to be in a strong position. The next few quarters are likely to be slower. Even the RBI has said that they will be slower. And over the last few years, the pattern has been that the Q2, Q3, Q4 tend to be slower than Q1. So the next few months, though, will be critical. But on that note, that's all we have for you. Thank you so much for watching. But before you go, I have an appeal to make before you, which is please do subscribe to The Print. It helps us do the kind of ground reporting that we have been doing for you, the effective coverage from across the country that we bring to you, and also it makes possible discussions like this. But apart from that, it gets you several benefits, such as the newsletter that comes into your mailboxes written by our editors, invites to our exclusive webinars that are hosted by our talented journalists that have experts coming in and talking. And you can write in for us in the Your Turn section, and we'll publish it as an article. So please do subscribe. The link is in the description of this video. And thank you so much for watching.